I'll never forget the sound of that check hitting the table. My mother slid it across to my sister Olivia, her smile wide and proud. $20,000, a full ride to her dream school. Then she looked at me. She deserved it, Mum said, her voice cold and final. But you didn't. I said nothing. What could I say? I watched my sister's face, guilt mixed with relief, and I knew my place in this family. So, I left. I sold the only thing I had left from my grandmother, a golden locket worth more in memory than money, and I survived on coffee, instant noodles and spite. They thought they'd broken me. They thought I'd come crawling back, begging for forgiveness, admitting they were right. They had no idea what was coming. Because 3 years later, when the university dean stood at that podium and announced the Grace Miller Full Scholarship Fund, when the cameras turned to my parents sitting in the front row, when my mother's face drained of colour and she literally couldn't breathe, I finally understood something. The best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right. And I was just getting started. My name is Grace Miller and I'm 22 years old. I work part-time at a coffee shop near campus while finishing my senior year at State College. People say I'm quiet, maybe too quiet, but the truth is I learned a long time ago that silence is safer than speaking up in my family. The dinner table was set beautifully that spring evening, just like it always was when Mum wanted to celebrate something. The good china gleamed under the chandelier, and the smell of roasted chicken filled our dining room. My sister Olivia sat across from me, practically glowing in her pressed white blouse, while Mum fussed over her like she'd just won the Nobel Prize. "Stanford," Mum said for what had to be the 10th time that evening, her voice dripping with pride. "My daughter is going to Stanford. Can you imagine out of thousands of applicants they chose you, sweetheart?" Olivia smiled, tucking a strand of her perfect blonde hair behind her ear. "Mom, you're embarrassing me." "Nonsense. You deserve all the praise in the world. You've worked so hard for this." Mom reached over and squeezed Olivia's hand, her eyes actually glistening with tears. I cut into my chicken, the knife scraping against the plate a little too loudly. Nobody looked up. Nobody asked about my acceptance letter to the teachings program, the one I'd gotten 3 weeks ago, and mentioned exactly once before the conversation shifted back to Olivia. Nobody asked about my GPA, or the dean's list, or the volunteer work I did at the elementary school every Thursday. My hand drifted to the locket around my neck, my grandmother's locket. It was simple, just gold-plated with a tiny clasp, but inside was a picture of Grandma and me from when I was 7. She'd given it to me 2 weeks before she died, pressing it into my palm and whispering, "You're stronger than you know, Gracie. Don't let anyone tell you different." Mum's eyes flicked to the locket and her expression hardened for just a moment. "Your grandmother always favoured you," she said, her tone light but with an edge I knew too well. "Spoiled you rotten, if you ask me." I touched the locket gently, feeling the warmth of the metal against my skin. I didn't respond. There was no point. Instead, I looked down at my plate and kept eating the chicken, suddenly tasting like cardboard. Dad sat at the head of the table, quiet as always. I glanced at him, hoping for something, anything, a smile, a wink, some sign that he saw me sitting there. He was looking at me, actually, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Our eyes met and I saw something flicker across his face. Was it sadness? Regret? Before I could figure it out, he looked away and cleared his throat softly. "Olivia's done very well," he said quietly, more to his plate than to anyone else. Mum beamed. "She has, and we're going to make sure she has everything she needs to succeed. This is her moment, her future. We can't let anything get in the way of that." The way she said it, the emphasis on her, made something cold settle in my stomach. I kept my face neutral, kept cutting my chicken into smaller and smaller pieces, kept pretending I didn't notice the way Olivia glanced at me with something that might have been guilt. When dinner finally ended, I helped clear the table in silence, while Mum and Olivia disappeared into the living room to look at Stanford brochures. Dad lingered in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching me rinse plates. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again and walked away. I stood at the sink, hands in soapy water, and stared out the window into the dark backyard. Something was coming. I could feel it in the air, heavy and inevitable like a storm about to break. That night, Mum said the words that changed everything. Connection to part 1. The previous section ended with, "That night, Mum said the words that changed everything." Context: Grace is still living at home, completing her senior year at State College while working part-time. She has just endured a dinner where her sister Olivia's Stanford acceptance dominated the conversation, leaving Grace feeling invisible. The tension in the household is palpable, and Grace senses something significant is about to happen. She's emotionally braced, but unprepared for what's coming. 1 week later, Mum called a family meeting. Those 3 words delivered via text message at 9 a.m. made my stomach drop. We didn't have family meetings. We had dinners where Mum talked and the rest of us listened. We had holidays where everyone pretended things were fine, but formal meetings. Those only happened when something serious was about to go down. I came home from my shift at the coffee shop that evening to find everyone already seated in the dining room. The same table where we'd celebrated Olivia a week ago now felt different, heavier somehow. Mum sat at the head, her posture rigid and formal. Dad was to her right, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. Olivia sat across from the empty chair that was clearly meant for me, her eyes fixed on the table. In front of Mum was an envelope. Not just any envelope, but the kind from banks, the official kind with a plastic window showing a check inside. I sat down slowly, my heart starting to hammer in my chest. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating until I couldn't stand it anymore. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Mum picked up the envelope, turning it over in her hands, like she was weighing something precious. "Your father and I have been discussing Olivia's future." She began, not looking at me. "Stanford is an incredible opportunity, but it's also expensive. Very expensive." I nodded, not sure where this was going, but feeling dread creep up my spine. "We've decided to pay for her education in full," Mum continued. "Tuition, housing, books, everything. She won't have to worry about loans or working during the school year. She can focus entirely on her studies and making the most of this opportunity." She slid the envelope across the table to Olivia. My sister's hand trembled slightly as she reached for it, but she didn't open it. She just held it, her eyes still downcast. "Mum, that's amazing!" I said, trying to sound happy even though my throat felt tight. "Olivia, that's really great." $20,000, Mum said, and I realised she wasn't done talking. "For the first year. We'll continue supporting her throughout her time there." I waited. Surely there was more. Surely she was about to say something about helping me too, even if it was less, even if it was just something. Mum finally looked at me and her eyes were cold. "Grace, I know you were hoping for financial help as well." "I wasn't expecting—" I started, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish." She folded her hands on the table, her voice calm and measured, like she was explaining a simple math problem. "Your father and I have thought long and hard about this. We have to make difficult decisions about where to invest our resources. Olivia has been accepted to one of the best universities in the country. She's maintained a 4.0 GPA. She's been class president captain of the debate team, and she's already received interest from several prestigious internship programs." Each word felt like a small cut, precise and deliberate. "You're going to State College," Mum continued. "It's a fine school, perfectly adequate. You're studying elementary education, which is a nice, stable career, but let's be honest, it's not Stanford. It's not a field that requires the same level of investment." I felt my nails digging into my palms under the table, but I kept my face blank. "Don't react," I told myself. Don't give her the satisfaction. Mum picked up her water glass, took a sip, and delivered the final blow with the casualness of someone commenting on the weather. She deserved it, but you didn't. The words hung in the air sharp and final. Olivia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Mum, then at me, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Dad's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down too hard, but he said nothing. He just stared into the dark liquid, like it held answers he couldn't voice. I waited for someone to laugh, to say it was a joke, a test of some kind. But Mum just looked at me with that same cold expression, waiting for my response. I couldn't give her one. If I opened my mouth, I would either scream or cry, and I refused to do either. Instead, I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. I stood up and still nobody moved. "Grace," Olivia whispered, finally finding her voice. "I didn't know she was going to—" I held up my hand, the same gesture Mum had used to silence me, and Olivia stopped talking. I walked out of the dining room with my head high, my footsteps measured and calm. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard Mum's voice drift up from below. She needs to learn that life isn't fair. The sooner she accepts that, the better off she'll be. I made it to my room and closed the door before my hands started shaking. I looked at myself in the mirror, at the golden locket resting against my chest. I touched it gently, remembering Grandma's words. "Maybe you were right, Grandma," I whispered to the empty room. "Maybe I'm on my own." That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to leave this house and never ask them for another thing. That night, I made myself a promise. I'd prove them wrong, even if it killed me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Mum's voice, cold and certain, telling me I wasn't worth the investment. So, at 5 a.m, when the sky was still dark and the house was silent, I got up and started packing. I didn't have much. A few changes of clothes, my textbooks, my laptop, some toiletries. Everything fit into the old backpack I'd used since high school, the one with the frayed straps and a broken zipper that never quite closed all the way. I looked around my room one last time at the pale yellow walls I'd picked out when I was 12, at the bookshelf full of novels I'd read and reread, at the desk where I'd written countless papers and studied for countless exams. None of it felt like mine anymore. I wrote a note on a piece of notebook paper and left it on the kitchen table. The words were simple because anything more would have broken me. "I'll find my own way. Don't worry about me." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The house was quiet as I moved through it, my footsteps careful on the hardwood floors. I thought I'd make it out without seeing anyone, but as I passed the living room, I saw a figure sitting in Dad's armchair. My heart jumped and I froze. Dad was sitting there in the darkness, still wearing yesterday's clothes, a glass of something amber-coloured on the side table next to him. He wasn't reading, wasn't watching TV, just sitting there, staring at nothing. When I stopped, he turned his head and looked at me. We didn't speak. What was there to say? I adjusted the backpack on my shoulder, and he just looked at me with those sad, tired eyes. For a moment, I thought he might stand up, might try to stop me, or at least ask me to stay. But he didn't. He just gave a small nod, so slight I almost missed it in the dim light. I nodded back and walked out the front door. The morning air was cold and damp, and I could see my breath in small clouds as I walked down the driveway. I didn't look back. If I looked back, I might lose my nerve, and I couldn't afford that. By 7, I was standing outside a pawn shop, 3 blocks from campus, waiting for it to open. The neon sign flickered weakly in the growing daylight, and through the barred windows I could see rows of guitars, electronics, jewellery, all the pieces of other people's desperation. The owner was a heavy-set man with kind eyes and calloused hands. He unlocked the door and raised an eyebrow when he saw me standing there. "Early bird," he said. "What can I do for you?" I walked in the bell above the door, chiming softly. My hand went to the locket around my neck, and for a moment I couldn't make myself unclasp it. This was Grandma's. The last piece of her I had left. The last thing that made me feel loved. But I needed to eat. I needed a place to sleep. I needed to survive. My hands trembled as I unclasped the chain and placed the locket on the glass counter. The owner picked it up gently, turning it over in his hands, opening the tiny clasp to see the picture inside. "This looks like a family heirloom," he said, his voice softer now. Are you sure about this?" I swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "It's the only family I have left," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "and I need it to build a new one." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can give you $850. That's more than its melt value, but I can tell it means something." $850. It would cover first month's rent on a room somewhere cheap, maybe some groceries, maybe a bus pass. It was enough to start. "Okay," I said. He counted out the bills carefully, then slid them across the counter. I picked them up with shaking hands and stuffed them into my wallet. As I turned to leave, he called out, "Hey kid, I'll hold on to this for 30 days. If you change your mind, if you can scrape the money together, you can buy it back. That's store policy." I nodded, but didn't say anything. We both knew I wouldn't be back. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk and looked back through the window at the locket now sitting in a small velvet tray under the fluorescent lights. It looked so small, so insignificant next to the other pieces of jewellery. I pressed my hand against the window, one last goodbye, then forced myself to walk away. I found a room for rent that afternoon, a tiny space in a house near campus that I'd share with 3 other students. The landlord barely looked at me when I handed over the cash for first month's rent. By evening, I'd unpacked my backpack and started my first shift at the coffee shop down the street. The manager hired me on the spot when I told her I could work any hours, any days. That night, exhausted and alone in my new room, I pulled out my wallet to count what was left of the pawnshop money. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper folded and tucked behind my student ID in handwriting I recognised immediately. Dad's handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to read it right away, but another part, the part that was still raw and angry, couldn't bear it. Not yet. Not when I was trying so hard to be strong. I tucked it back into my wallet and closed my eyes. I sold my grandmother's love to buy my freedom. I didn't know then that note in my wallet would change my life. The first 2 months on my own taught me exactly how expensive freedom was. I worked the morning shift at the coffee shop from 6 to noon, rushing to campus for afternoon classes, then heading straight to the restaurant where I waited tables from 6 until close, sometimes not getting home until after midnight. I'd collapse into bed, set my alarm for 5, and do it all over again. Sleep became something I rationed like food 4 or 5 hours if I was lucky, less if I had a paper due or an exam to study for. My diet consisted mainly of instant ramen, with an egg cracked into it. If I was feeling extravagant, and day-old bread the restaurant let me take home. I learned to love black coffee because milk and sugar cost extra. I learned which convenience stores marked down their sandwiches at what time. I learned to smile at customers even when my feet were screaming and my eyes burned with exhaustion. My classmates had no idea. I sat next to them in lectures, participated in discussions, turned in my assignments on time. They talked about weekend trips and new clothes and which restaurants they wanted to try. I nodded along, never mentioned that I was one of the people serving them those meals, never let on that I was counting pennies to make rent. It was in the library 3 weeks before finals when the offer came. I was hunched over my laptop at my usual table in the back corner, trying to finish an essay on educational philosophy while fighting to keep my eyes open. That's when Brandon Mitchell sat down across from me. I knew him vaguely from my teaching methods class. He always sat in the back, always showed up late, usually looking like he'd just rolled out of bed. "Grace Wright," he said, his voice low. "You're the one who got an A on that Dewey analysis paper." I looked up warily. "Yeah? Why?" He leaned forward, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I need help with the final research paper. It's worth 40% of our grade, and I'm barely passing the class as it is. My dad will kill me if I don't pull at least a B. Office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays, I said, turning back to my laptop. Professor Wright is really helpful if you... No, you don't understand. Brandon pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, showing me the screen. I'm not asking for tutoring. I'm asking you to write it for me. I'll pay you $500 cash. My fingers froze on the keyboard. $500. That was more than my rent. That was groceries for a month. That was the safety net I desperately needed. I know you need the money. Brandon continued, his tone almost sympathetic. I've seen you at that Italian place on 5th Street. My family eats there sometimes. You're working yourself to death, Grace. $500 for one paper. Nobody would ever know. I stared at the number on his screen, my mind racing through calculations. My rent was due in a week and I was $40 short. I'd been planning to skip a few meals, maybe pick up an extra shift, but $500 would solve everything. It would give me breathing room. It would let me sleep. 20 pages, Brandon said, sensing my hesitation. Standard research format. I'll give you the topics and sources to include. You're a good writer. It would probably only take you a weekend. A weekend? 2 days of work for more money than I made in 2 weeks of serving coffee and carrying plates. My hand actually reached for my backpack, ready to pull out a notebook, ready to take down the details. Then I caught my reflection in the dark window across from me. I looked terrible. Dark circles under my eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, my grandmother's cardigan hanging loose on my frame, because I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. But it was my face that stopped me. I looked like someone I didn't recognize. Grandma's voice came back to me clear as if she was sitting right there. Never compromise your integrity, Gracie. The moment you do, you lose the one thing nobody can take from you. I closed my laptop and stood up, my legs shaky with exhaustion and the weight of what I was about to turn down. I can't help you, I said quietly. Brandon's face hardened. Are you serious? Do you know how much money that is? I know exactly how much it is. My what? I said, shouldering my backpack. And I know what it would cost me to take it. I walked away before I could change my mind, before the rational part of my brain could scream at me for being an idiot. My hands were trembling as I packed up my things, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. $500. I'd just walked away from $500. I made it to the library bathroom and locked myself in a stall, pressing my forehead against the cool metal door. I would eat ramen for another week. I would pick up extra shifts. I would figure it out somehow. But I wouldn't sell the one thing I had left that was truly mine. When I came back to my table to grab my water bottle, I found a $20 bill tucked under my notebook, with a small note written on a torn piece of paper. For coffee and courage. There was no name, no signature. I looked around the library, but I didn't see anyone watching. I picked up the bill with shaking hands, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. I didn't know someone was watching. I didn't know that one honest choice would open a door I never knew existed. Professor Daniel Wright asked me to stay after class on a Tuesday in late October, and my first thought was that I'd done something wrong. Miss Miller, could you hang back for a moment? He said as students filed out, their voices echoing in the hallway. My stomach dropped. I'd turned in my last paper on time, hadn't I? I ran through my recent assignments in my head, trying to figure out what I'd messed up. Professor Wright was one of my favourite instructors, the kind who actually seemed to care about what he was teaching. He was in his mid-40s, with greying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he had a way of making educational theory feel urgent and real instead of abstract and boring. I gathered my book slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe my last essay wasn't up to standard. Maybe he'd noticed me falling asleep during the lecture last week. Maybe he somehow knew about Brandon's offer and thought I'd actually taken it. When the room emptied, he gestured to a chair near his desk. Please, sit. I sat clutching my backpack in my lap like a shield. Professor Wright settled into his own chair, removing his glasses and cleaning them with the edge of his shirt. The silence stretched out and I felt my pulse quicken. Am I in trouble? I finally asked, unable to stand it anymore. He looked up, surprised, then smiled slightly. No, Grace, not at all. Actually, quite the opposite. He put his glasses back on and studied me for a moment. I wanted to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. I nodded, not trusting my voice. What keeps you going when no one believes in you? The question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth closed. It tried again. Nobody had ever asked me anything like that before. Nobody had ever asked me about me at all, really. I don't understand, I managed. I've been teaching for 20 years, Professor Wright said, leaning back in his chair. I've learned to recognize certain qualities in students: drive, resilience, integrity. You have all three, but there's something else. Something that makes you keep showing up, even when it would be easier to quit. My throat tightened. I'm not special, Professor. I'm just trying to get through school. While working 2 jobs, he said quietly, while living on almost nothing, while turning down easy money because it would compromise your principles. My face went hot. You heard that in the library. I did. He folded his hands on his desk. I was sitting 2 tables behind you working on a grant proposal. I heard everything, and I watched you walk away from more money than most students see in a month. I looked down at my hands, not knowing what to say. Part of me felt exposed, embarrassed that he'd witnessed that moment of weakness. The other part felt something else, something I couldn't quite name. I'm conducting research on educational equity, Professor Wright continued, specifically on how low-income students navigate higher education without family support. I'm also working with a small team to help match students with scholarships and resources they might not know about. It's not a big operation, just me and a few graduate assistants, but we've helped dozens of students find funding over the past 2 years. He paused, watching my reaction. I'd like you to join the project. You'd work with me a few hours a week, helping research scholarship opportunities, reaching out to students who might need help sharing your own experiences to inform our approach. I can pay you $15 an hour, which I know isn't much, but it's something. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. Why me? I'm just a nobody. I'm barely keeping my own head above water. You're not nobody, Professor Wright said firmly. You're someone who chose integrity over easy money. That's rare grace, rarer than you think. Most people would have taken that $500 and rationalized it somehow. But you didn't. You walked away even though it cost you something real. He leaned forward. That tells me more about your character than any grade on a paper ever could. My eyes stung with sudden tears and I blinked them back furiously. I wasn't going to cry in front of my professor. I don't know what to say, I whispered. Say yes, he said simply. Come to my office Thursday afternoon. We'll talk about the project, go over what would be expected, and you can decide if it's something you want to be part of. No pressure, no obligation. I thought about my rent due in a week. I thought about the instant ramen I'd eaten for dinner the last 4 nights. I thought about the exhaustion that had become my constant companion. $15 an hour for a few hours a week wouldn't solve all my problems, but it would help. It would give me room to breathe. But more than that, it would give me something I hadn't had in months. Purpose. The feeling that someone saw value in me. Okay, I said. Yes, thank you. Professor Wright smiled and it transformed his whole face. Good. Thursday at 3. And, Grace, bring your appetite. I always order too much food for these meetings. I left his office in a daze, my backpack feeling lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time since I'd walked out of my parents' house, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. I didn't know then that he wasn't just a mentor. He was the man my father trusted with my future. I made it 8 months before my body decided it had had enough. Working with Professor Wright had helped. The $15 an hour, even for just 10 hours a week, made a real difference. I could afford protein occasionally. I could pay rent without panic. I could breathe a little easier, but I didn't cut back on my other jobs. I couldn't afford to. And I didn't want to seem weak, didn't want Professor Wright to regret taking a chance on me. So I kept pushing, kept telling myself I could handle it, kept ignoring the warning signs, the headaches, the way my hands sometimes shook for no reason, the heart palpitations that woke me in the middle of the night, the fact that I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept more than 4 hours at a stretch. It happened on a Thursday morning at the coffee shop right in the middle of the breakfast rush. I was carrying a tray of drinks to a table by the window when the room started to tilt. The faces around me blurred, and suddenly I couldn't remember where I was or what I was doing. The tray slipped from my hands and I heard the crash of ceramic and glass from very far away. Then my knees buckled and everything went dark. I woke up to fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of a hospital. My head was pounding and there was an IV in my arm. For a confused moment, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing, that I was still at home in my old bed, that Mum would walk in any second with a thermometer, and that worried expression she used to get when Olivia was sick. Then I turned my head and saw Professor Wright sitting in the chair beside my bed, his face drawn with concern. "You're awake," he said, leaning forward. "How do you feel? What happened?" My voice came out as a croak. "You collapsed at the coffee shop. I was there getting my morning coffee and saw you go down." He ran a hand through his hair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Grace, when's the last time you had a full meal? When's the last time you've slept through the night?" I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced me back down. "I'm fine. I just need to get back to work. My shift isn't over, and I have class this afternoon, and the doctor says you have severe malnutrition and sleep deprivation." Professor Wright interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Your body is shutting down, Grace. You can't keep doing this." Something about the way he said it, the kindness in his voice, broke something inside me that I'd been holding together with sheer willpower. Tears started flowing before I could stop them, hot and fast and unstoppable. I pressed my hands over my face, embarrassed, but I couldn't make them stop. "I can't quit," I sobbed. "I can't go back. I can't let them be right about me." Professor Wright didn't say anything. He just pulled his chair closer and let me cry occasionally, handing me tissues from the box on the bedside table. I cried for everything. For the mother who didn't believe in me. For the sister who took what should have been shared. For the grandmother I'd sold for $850. For 8 months of pretending I was fine when I was drowning. Maybe they were right. I finally said, my voice raw. Maybe I'm not strong enough. Maybe I don't deserve any of this. Maybe I should just drop out, go home, apologize, and... "Stop," Professor Wright said quietly. It was the first time I'd heard him use that tone, and it cut through my spiral. "Grace, look at me." I lowered my hands and met his eyes. "You know what separates people who succeed from people who quit?" he asked. "It's not talent, it's not luck, it's not even money or opportunity. It's the choice to get up one more time than you fall down. That's it. That's the only difference." "But I can't keep doing this," I whispered. "I'm so tired." "I know." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Which is why I talked to the department head yesterday. The university has a research fund for students working on equity projects. I applied on your behalf." He held out the envelope. "This is for you." My hand shook as I took it and opened the flap. Inside was a check made out to me for $2,000. I stared at it, unable to process what I was seeing. "I don't understand." "It's not charity," Professor Wright said. "It's an investment. The university invests in students who show promise, who demonstrate commitment to making education more accessible. You've done that, Grace. You've helped me reach students who would have fallen through the cracks. You've shared your story in ways that have informed our entire approach. This is you earning something you've already worked for." I looked at the check again, then at him, and for the first time in months I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt hope. "Thank you," I managed. "Thank me by taking care of yourself," he said. Cut back your hours at the restaurant, sleep, eat real food. You can't help anyone if you work yourself to death. I nodded, holding the envelope against my chest like it might disappear if I let go. $2,000. It was more money than I'd had at once since I'd left home. It was breathing room. It was safety. It was the proof that someone believed I was worth investing in. That night, lying in my narrow bed, in my tiny room, I made a new promise. Not to my family, not to Professor Wright, but to myself. If I survived this, if I made it through, I'd make sure no one else had to suffer alone the way I had. The doctor had ordered me to rest, so that's what I did for the first time in 8 months. I called in sick to the restaurant, told my boss at the coffee shop I needed a few days off and just stayed in my room. I slept 12 hours straight that first night, then woke up and slept another 6. I made actual food, scrambled eggs and toast, and ate it slowly at my tiny desk. I sat by the window and watched people walk by on the street below doing absolutely nothing, and it felt like the most radical thing I'd ever done. On the 3rd day, I finally had enough energy to tidy up my room, which had become chaotic during my months of barely functioning. I folded clothes, organised my textbooks, threw away empty ramen containers I'd been too exhausted to deal with. When I picked up my backpack to sort through it, my wallet fell out and landed open on the floor. That's when I saw it again. The note. I'd carried it with me for 8 months, tucked behind my student ID, and never once opened it. In those early days, I'd been too angry, too hurt, too determined to prove I didn't need anyone. Then, I'd been too busy surviving to think about it. And, after a while, it had just become part of the landscape of my wallet, something I saw but didn't really register anymore. But now, sitting on my floor with afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, I finally pulled it out. The paper was worn at the creases from being folded and unfolded in my wallet over months of use. I recognised my father's handwriting immediately, that careful, precise script he used for important things. My hand shook slightly as I unfolded it. If you ever need help, look for Professor Daniel Wright. He's a good man. I trust him with your future. Love, Dad. I read it 3 times, each word sinking in deeper. Professor Daniel Wright. My father had written his name, had known exactly who to send me to, had arranged this whole thing before I even left. I thought back to that morning, Dad sitting in his armchair in the dark watching me leave. The way he'd nodded so slight I'd almost missed it. I'd thought it was resignation, acceptance of my departure, but it wasn't. It was acknowledgement. It was him telling me without words that he'd done what he could. And Professor Wright, the way he'd happened to be in the library when Brandon offered me money, the way he'd happened to be at the coffee shop when I collapsed, the $20 bill with its note about coffee and courage. How much of it had been coincidence, and how much had been my father's quiet intervention. Tears started falling, but they felt different from the ones in the hospital. These weren't tears of despair or exhaustion. These were something more complicated, gratitude mixed with grief, love mixed with anger. He'd known what Mum was going to do, and he hadn't stopped her. But he'd also made sure I wouldn't be completely alone. He'd given me a lifeline without ever admitting it, without ever taking credit, without ever acknowledging what he was doing. I pressed the note against my chest and let myself cry for the father who loved me, but couldn't say so, who helped me, but couldn't defend me, who sent me into the world, but made sure someone was watching. After a while, the tears stopped, and I just sat there holding the note, thinking about what to do with this information. I could call home. I could tell Dad I found the note, that I understood, that I forgave him. Part of me desperately wanted to hear his voice, to tell him I was okay, to thank him. But another part of me understood why he'd written the note instead of speaking. Some things couldn't be said out loud. Some acts of love required silence, required distance, required sacrifice. If I called him, if I acknowledged what he'd done, it would force him to choose between his wife and his daughter in a way he clearly couldn't handle. And maybe I wasn't ready to forgive yet. Not completely, because he could have stopped it. He could have stood up to Mum. He could have said the words that night at dinner, could have said them when she handed Olivia that check. He could have chosen me. But he'd also done this, and that had to mean something. I folded the note carefully and put it back in my wallet, but this time, in a different spot in the clear sleeve where I could see it every time I opened it. A reminder. Not of what I'd lost, but of what had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. I pulled out a piece of notebook paper and started writing. Dear Dad, I found your note. Thank you for Professor Wright. Thank you for believing I could do this. I wish you could have said it out loud, but I understand why you couldn't. I'm not ready to come home yet. I don't know if I ever will be, but I want you to know I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I'm going to make you proud, even if you can never tell me so. Love, Grace. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and tucked it into my desk drawer. I didn't address it. I didn't put a stamp on it. I knew I'd never send it. But writing it felt like closing a door that had been left open, like finishing a conversation that had never really started. For the first time I understood. Sometimes the loudest love is the one that never makes a sound. Understanding my father's silent love didn't heal everything, but it gave me something I desperately needed. Permission to move forward without bitterness. I threw myself into the scholarship project with a focus I hadn't known I was capable of. Every morning, I woke up with purpose. Every email I sent to a struggling student, every scholarship application I helped complete, every financial aid form I walked someone through, felt like I was rewriting my own story. Except this time with a better ending. Professor Wright had been right. Helping others was how I healed my own wounds. By the end of that academic year, we'd helped 53 students secure scholarships or financial aid they hadn't known existed. 53 students who might have dropped out, who might have worked themselves sick like I had, who might have given up on their dreams because money stood in the way. They sent thank you letters. Not all of them, but enough. I kept every single one in a folder in my desk drawer, right next to the unsent letter to my father. On hard days when the old feelings of worthlessness crept back in, I'd pull them out and read them. Because of you, I can stay in school. You changed my life. I didn't think anyone cared until I met you. Those words meant more to me than any grade I'd ever received. The campus newspaper found out about the project in March. A journalism student interviewed Professor Wright and me, took photos of us with some of the students we'd helped. When the article came out, I barely recognised the person in the photo. She looked confident, standing among a group of smiling students, her hand on someone's shoulder. She looked like someone who mattered. The article spread faster than I expected. Within a week, I received an email from the Office of Student Affairs asking if I'd be willing to speak at a symposium on educational equity they were hosting in April. The topic was fairness in educational opportunity, and they wanted someone who understood the issue from personal experience. I almost said no. Speaking in front of a crowd about my own struggles felt too raw, too exposing. But Professor Wright encouraged me. Your story matters, Grace, he said. Not because it's tragic, but because you survived it. Because you're using it to help others. That's what people need to hear. So, I said yes. The symposium was held in the university's largest lecture hall. 200 people filled the seats, mostly faculty and graduate students, but also some undergraduates and even a few people from local education nonprofits. I stood backstage, my hands shaking, my carefully prepared note cards damp with sweat. When they called my name, I walked out into the lights and looked at all those faces, and for a moment I forgot every word I'd planned to say. Then I remembered why I was there. I told them about being a low-income student, about working 2 jobs while trying to maintain my grades, about the choice between eating and buying textbooks, about the exhaustion that became normal, about the isolation of feeling like you didn't belong. I didn't mention my family by name, didn't talk about my mother's rejection or my sister's check. I kept it general enough that it could be anyone's story, but it was mine. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly everyone was on their feet. I stood there stunned as 200 people applauded, not because I was special, but because I'd been honest. Afterward, at least a dozen people came up to talk to me. Faculty members who wanted to know more about the project, students who shared their own struggles. A woman from a local foundation who asked if I'd be interested in consulting on their scholarship programs. Professor Wright found me in the lobby surrounded by people, and he was beaming. "You did it," he said when the crowd finally dispersed. "You took your pain and turned it into purpose." Later that week, we met in his office for our regular project meeting. He'd ordered sandwiches as always, but this time there was something different in his expression. Excitement, maybe, or hope. "Grace, I want to ask you something," he said, leaning forward. "You remind me what education should stand for, not privilege, but perseverance. Not who you know, but what you're willing to work for." I waited, sensing something important was coming. "Have you ever thought about creating something permanent?" he asked, "something that lasts beyond us, beyond this project?" I wasn't sure what he meant. Like what? Like an endowment, a scholarship fund, something with your name on it that continues helping students long after we're both gone. The idea was so big, I couldn't quite grasp it. "I don't have that kind of money, Professor," he smiled. "Not yet, but you have something more valuable. You have a story that moves people. You have credibility. You have the kind of lived experience that makes donors want to invest." He paused. "I think you could build something extraordinary, Grace. I think you already are." I left his office that day with my head spinning. A scholarship fund with my name on it. It felt impossible, like a dream for someone else's life, but the seed was planted. Over the next few weeks, opportunities kept appearing. The university invited me to join the Student Success Committee. The Dean of Students asked me to consult on a new first-generation student support program. People who'd heard me speak at the symposium reached out with ideas offers of help connections. My life was changing, and I was changing with it. I wasn't the girl who had collapsed in a coffee shop anymore. I wasn't the girl eating ramen and crying in bathroom stalls. I was becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who could help others find their way. Then one day, a familiar name appeared in my inbox and everything changed again. The email sat in my inbox for 3 hours before I could bring myself to open it. Olivia Miller, the preview line read, "I don't expect you to read this, but I need to say it anyway." I stared at her name on my screen during my shift at the coffee, during my afternoon class, during my evening meeting with Professor Wright. Every time I reached for my phone to open it, my stomach twisted and I put it away again. Finally, sitting in my room that night with a cup of tea, I wasn't drinking, I clicked on it. The email was long, several paragraphs, but the first line made me catch my breath. "Grace, I left Stanford. I know you probably don't care, but I thought you should know." I read on, my heart pounding. She explained that she'd struggled from the beginning. The coursework was harder than anything she'd faced in high school. She'd been unprepared, overwhelmed, drowning in expectations she couldn't meet. Her grades declined. She developed anxiety so severe she couldn't sleep. And through it all, she kept thinking about that night at the dinner table, about the check about my face when Mum said those words. "I realised I didn't deserve any of it," she wrote. Not the money, not the opportunity, not the praise. I'd been handed everything, and I didn't know how to work for anything. I didn't know who I was without Mum telling me I was special. She'd withdrawn from Stanford after 3 semesters and moved back home, but she didn't stay long. She got a job, found her own apartment, and started volunteering at a free tutoring centre for underprivileged kids. "I'm sorry," she wrote near the end. "I'm sorry I took that check. I'm sorry I didn't say something that night. I'm sorry I was such a coward. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to respond. But I needed you to know that you were right to leave and I was wrong to stay silent. You deserved better. You always did." I read the email 3 times, my emotions churning. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad for her. Part of me was still angry. But the biggest part of me felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that she'd figured it out. Relief that she wasn't still living in that bubble of unearned privilege. Relief that maybe Just maybe my family wasn't entirely beyond redemption. I didn't respond that night. I needed time to process, to figure out what, if anything, I wanted to say. 3 weeks later, I was dropping off some scholarship applications at a community centre downtown when I saw her. Olivia was sitting at a table with 3 elementary school kids helping them with homework. She wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked different, smaller somehow, more real. One of the kids asked her a question and she smiled patiently, explaining something about fractions with a gentleness I'd never seen in her before. I stood in the doorway frozen. I could turn around, walk away, pretend I hadn't seen her. But something made me stay. She looked up and saw me. Her face went pale and for a moment neither of us moved. Then she said something to the kids, stood up and walked over to me. We faced each other across the lobby, 2 sisters who'd become strangers. "Grace," she said quietly, "I didn't know you came here." "I didn't know you worked here," I replied. Silence stretched between us, heavy, with 2 years of unsaid words. "I got your email," I finally said. Her eyes filled with tears. "I meant every word." "I know. I spent my whole life getting things I didn't earn," Olivia said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm learning what it means to actually deserve something. What it feels like to work for something and know it's yours because you earned it, not because someone handed it to you." I looked at this version of my sister, this person who'd been humbled and broken and was trying to rebuild herself into something authentic, and I felt my anger begin to dissolve. I didn't hug her, I didn't say, "I forgive you," but I nodded, and I smiled just a little. "How long have you been volunteering here?" I asked. 8 months. It's the first thing I've ever done that felt real." We talked for a few minutes, surface conversation about the centre, about the kids she worked with, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. When I left, she walked me to the door. "Grace," she said as I was leaving, "do you think I'll ever be good enough the way you are?" I turned back to look at her. "You already are, Olivia. You just needed to prove it to yourself, not to them." Her face crumpled and she nodded, unable to speak. Over the next few months, we didn't become close. We didn't have weekly coffee dates or long phone conversations. But occasionally, we'd run into each other at the community centre. We'd exchange a few words, small updates, carefully building something fragile and new. I learned later from a mutual acquaintance that Olivia had started following news about me. When the campus paper wrote about the scholarship project, she'd saved the article. When I spoke at the symposium, she'd asked someone to record it so she could watch it later. She was proud of me in her quiet way. And slowly, carefully, I was beginning to be proud of her too. I didn't know then that she'd be the first person to stand and applaud when my name was called. The invitation came in April, 2 months before graduation. Dean Richardson called me into her office personally, which was unusual enough to make me nervous. But when I arrived, she was smiling, and Professor Wright was already there, looking pleased with himself. "Grace, sit down," the dean said, gesturing to a chair. "We have a proposal for you." They wanted me to be part of a major symposium the university was hosting in May, focused on academic integrity and educational opportunity. It would be a big event, they explained, with speakers from across the country, media coverage and significant donors in attendance. "But that's not all," Dean Richardson continued, leaning forward with barely contained excitement. "We've been working behind the scenes for months and we've secured funding for a new scholarship program. It will provide full-ride scholarships to low-income students who demonstrate both academic promise and personal integrity." My heart started racing. "That's incredible." "It is," she agreed, "and we want to name it after you, the Grace Miller Scholarship Fund." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "After me. Your story, your work, your advocacy, it's inspired significant donations," Professor Wright said. "People want to invest in students like you, students who refuse to give up." "But we need to keep it secret until the ceremony," Dean Richardson added quickly. "We want it to be a surprise. A moment of recognition, not just for you, but for every student who's had to fight for their education. I sat there speechless, my mind struggling to process what they were telling me. "This is your moment, Grace," Professor Wright said softly. "Are you ready?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. What I didn't know was that the university had sent formal invitations to my family. I learned this later, piecing together the story from Olivia. The invitation had arrived at my parents' house in early May, elegant and official, with the university seal embossed on heavy cardstock. It read, "You are cordially invited to attend a ceremony honouring your daughter's outstanding achievements in educational advocacy and student support." Mum had opened it, read it twice, and immediately started planning what she would wear. She assumed, of course, that it was about Olivia, some recognition for her Stanford acceptance perhaps, or an award she'd forgotten to mention. She never considered it might be about me. Dad had read the invitation more carefully, Olivia told me. He'd noticed it didn't specify which daughter. He'd asked Mum if she was sure it was for Olivia, but Mum had waved him off. "Of course it is. Grace went to state college. They don't have ceremonies for that." Olivia had received her own invitation, a separate one, and she'd known immediately what it meant. She'd been following my work, had heard through the community centre network about the scholarship fund being established. But when she tried to tell our parents, Mum had cut her off. "Don't be silly. The university wouldn't honour someone who walked away from her family." So Olivia had kept quiet, and our parents had arrived at the ceremony with completely wrong expectations. The day of the event, I stood backstage in the university's grand auditorium, my hands shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. Through a gap in the curtain, I could see the seats filling up. 300 people, Professor Wright had told me. Faculty, students, donors, local media community partners, and somewhere in that crowd, my family. I spotted them as they were being escorted to their seats. Front row centre. Mum wore a navy blue dress and pearls, her hair perfectly styled. Dad wore a dark suit I'd never seen before. They looked elegant, confident, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Mum kept turning around, scanning the backstage area, clearly looking for Olivia. She leaned over and said something to Dad, who just shook his head and stared straight ahead. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. Then I saw Olivia. She'd chosen a seat in the back row, as far from our parents as possible. She was already crying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and the ceremony hadn't even started. Professor Wright appeared at my elbow. "Your family's here." "I know." "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath and turned away from the curtain. "I don't know. Ask me in an hour." The auditorium lights dimmed. The murmur of conversation faded. Dean Richardson walked out onto the stage, her heels clicking on the polished wood floor, and the audience fell silent. I watched from the wings as she approached the podium, adjusted the microphone and smiled out at the crowd. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very special occasion." In the front row, Mum sat up straighter, preparing to be proud of the wrong daughter. Dad's jaw was clenched so tight I could see it from where I stood. Olivia had both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. And I stood in the shadows, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. They had no idea whose name they were about to hear, and neither did the rest of the world. Dean Richardson's voice filled the auditorium, warm and authoritative. "We gather tonight to celebrate not just academic achievement, but something more fundamental. The resilience of the human spirit, the power of integrity, the determination to succeed against impossible odds." I watched from the wings as she paused, letting the words settle over the audience. 2 years ago, a young woman came to this university with nothing but a backpack and a fierce determination to prove she belonged here. She worked multiple jobs. She lived on almost nothing. She collapsed from exhaustion in a coffee shop because she refused to give up on her education. In the front row, Mum's posture shifted slightly. Something in the dean's words had registered, though she didn't yet understand what. But she didn't just survive, She thrived. She built a program that has helped over 80 students find scholarships and financial aid. She's become a voice for educational equity, speaking truth to power about what it really takes to succeed when the system isn't built for you. Dad's face had gone very still. He knew. I could see it in the way he'd stopped breathing, the way his eyes had begun to glisten. Tonight, thanks to the generosity of several donors who were moved by her story, we are proud to announce the establishment of the Grace Miller Full Scholarship Fund. The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Then, Dean Richardson turned toward the wings and extended her hand. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished alumna, Ms. Grace Miller. The auditorium exploded. 300 people rose to their feet as one applause washing over me like a wave. I stepped out onto the stage, the lights bright in my eyes, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't quite believe this was real. Through the applause, I heard a sound that made me look toward the back of the room. Olivia was on her feet, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt, tears streaming down her face, her expression a mixture of joy and regret and pride. She was the first one standing, I realized. The very first. Then I looked at the front row. Mum had turned white, her hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't get air. She clutched at Dad's arm, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her eyes were wide with shock, with something that looked almost like panic. Dad's face was wet with tears. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride and pain mixed together, and when Mum grabbed his arm, he gently removed her hand and stood up. He was clapping too slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving mine. I walked to the podium, my legs steadier than I'd expected. Dean Richardson embraced me briefly, then stepped aside, and suddenly I was alone at the microphone, looking out at hundreds of faces, at the cameras recording everything, at my mother, who looked like she might faint at my father, who was openly crying at my sister, who was still clapping even though everyone else had begun to sit down. Thank you, I said, my voice carrying through the sound system. Thank you all so much. The room settled into silence, expectant. I touched the locket at my throat, a new one I'd bought with my first real paycheck, simple silver with no picture inside. Just empty space waiting to be filled with new memories. 2 years ago, I didn't think I'd make it to this moment, I began. I thought I'd have to choose between my education and my survival. I thought I'd have to give up on my dreams because I didn't have the support I needed. I could see people nodding, relating to the story they thought they knew. But I learned something important. I learned that worth isn't something someone else can give you or take away. It's something you build yourself piece by piece, choice by choice, through the hardest moments of your life. The Q&A session came afterward. A reporter from the local news stood up, microphone in hand. Ms. Miller, this is an incredible honour. What inspired you to create this scholarship fund? What made you want to help other students in similar situations? I'd known this question was coming. I'd prepared an answer, something diplomatic and general. But standing there looking at my mother's pale face and my father's tears at Olivia's encouraging nod, I decided to tell the truth. I looked directly at Mum, holding her gaze even as she tried to look away. I created this fund for every girl who was told she wasn't enough, I said quietly, clearly. For every daughter who heard she deserved it, but you didn't. For every young woman who had to prove her worth alone without the support she should have had from the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. Mum made a small sound, almost a gasp. Because the truth is, we all deserve a chance. Every single one of us. And no one, not a parent, not a teacher, not society, should get to decide our worth. That's something we have to claim for ourselves. The room was absolutely silent. Mum stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She was trembling, her hand shaking as she grabbed her purse. Dad reached for her, but she pulled away and stumbled toward the aisle. She didn't look back. Didn't look at me, just moved as fast as she could toward the exit. Dad didn't follow her immediately. He stood there facing me across the rows of seats, and our eyes met. He mouthed 2 words I'd waited 2 years to hear. "I'm sorry." Then he nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, of pride of love he'd never been able to speak out loud, and he walked after my mother. I watched them go, and I felt nothing but peace. I didn't say her name. I didn't have to. The truth had finally spoken for itself. The story hit the local paper the next morning. I was in my room, still in my pajamas, drinking coffee and trying to process everything that had happened when Professor Wright texted me a link. "You should see this," was all he wrote. The headline read, "From rejection to redemption, local student creates scholarship fund after family refused to pay for her education." They'd gotten the broad strokes right. The article described my work with the scholarship project, quoted parts of my speech, and included a photo from the ceremony of me standing at the podium, but it was the sidebar that made my breath catch. Students nationwide face similar struggles, with statistics about family financial support and educational equity. I wasn't alone. I'd never been alone. By noon, the story had been picked up by the regional news. By evening, it was on several national education blogs. My inbox exploded with messages. Hundreds of them. Students sharing their own stories of family rejection, of choosing education over approval of struggling alone. Faculty members from other universities asking about the scholarship model, journalists requesting interviews. My phone rang constantly. Local TV stations, podcasts, online magazines. Everyone wanted to talk to me, wanted me to expand on my story, wanted details about my family that I had no intention of sharing. I declined most of them. I'd said what I needed to say at the ceremony. I didn't want to become a tragedy, to be consumed and discussed and dissected for entertainment. This wasn't about revenge or public humiliation. It was about creating something that would outlast the pain. But I did agree to one interview with a small education-focused podcast because they wanted to talk about the scholarship model, not about my mother. That evening, sitting in my quiet room, as the sun set outside my window, I received a text from an unknown number. It took me a moment to realise it was Olivia. She'd changed her number since I'd left home. The message was long, and I had to scroll to read it all. "Grace, I don't even know where to start. I'm so proud of you. Watching you up there so strong and certain and true. I realised what courage actually looks like. I wish I'd had even a fraction of that courage back then. I wish I'd stood up and said something. I wish I'd told Mum she was wrong. I'm sorry I took what should have been yours. I'm sorry I let you walk out alone. But thank you for showing me it's never too late to become who we're meant to be. Thank you for proving that we can choose different than how we were raised. I love you, sister. I always have, even when I was too scared to say it." I read it 3 times, tears blurring my vision. 3 years. It had been 3 years since anyone in my family had told me they loved me. 3 years since I'd heard those words from Olivia's voice, even if it was only in text form. I saved the message, then typed a reply, keeping it simple, because anything more would have made me fall apart. "Thank you for being brave enough to change. That's all that matters now. I love you too." I hit send and sat there holding my phone, feeling something shift in my chest. Forgiveness, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. But my parents didn't call, didn't text, didn't send any message at all. The silence from them was absolute and deafening. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I'd moved past needing their approval or their apology. I told myself that Dad's silent "I'm sorry" at the ceremony was enough, that I didn't need anything more. But I checked my phone constantly anyway. Every notification made my heart jump. Every time I saw a message, I hoped for a moment it would be from Dad, some explanation, some acknowledgement beyond that brief moment in the auditorium. Professor Wright noticed. We met for coffee 3 days after the ceremony, and he watched me check my phone for the 4th time in 20 minutes. "Waiting for something?" he asked gently. "No." I lied. He didn't push, but he knew. Of course, he knew. He'd probably been in contact with my father all along, had probably even encouraged Dad to reach out, but Dad hadn't. And I was beginning to accept that maybe he never would. Mum, I understood. She'd built her entire identity around being right, around her judgments and decisions being unquestionable. Admitting she'd been wrong would require dismantling everything she believed about herself. I didn't expect anything from her. I'm not sure I even wanted anything from her anymore. But Dad was different. Dad had always been different. He'd left me that note had connected me with Professor Wright, had been helping me from the shadows all along. He'd stood and applauded at the ceremony. He'd mouthed those words, "I'm sorry." Surely that meant something. Surely that meant he'd reach out eventually. A week passed, then 2. The media attention began to fade. Life started returning to normal, or whatever normal meant now. I finished my final exams. I walked at graduation with Professor Wright cheering from the audience, and Olivia sitting in the back row with tears in her eyes. I accepted a position as a graduate assistant working on expanding the scholarship program while pursuing my master's degree. But every night before I went to sleep, I checked my phone one last time. Just in case. Just hoping. I told myself I didn't need their apology. But deep down, I was still waiting for one person to reach out. Dad. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, 3 weeks and 2 days after the ceremony. I was alone in my office, a small space the university had given me for the scholarship program, reviewing applications and trying to focus, despite the summer heat that made the ancient air conditioning rattle and wheeze. When I heard the knock on the door, I assumed it was Professor Wright or one of the student workers. I opened the door and froze. Dad stood in the hallway and he looked like he'd aged 10 years. His hair, which had been salt and pepper at the ceremony, was now almost entirely grey. His face was drawn lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt that hung a little loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight. We stood there, father and daughter, staring at each other across the threshold. Neither of us knew what to say first. "Grace!" He finally managed, his voice rough. "Can we talk? I owe you more than words, but words are all I have right now." I stepped back wordlessly and let him in. He moved slowly, like someone much older than his 56 years, and sat in the chair across from my desk. I returned to my seat, my hands folded on the desktop, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 3 weeks, he began, not meeting my eyes. "I've written a dozen letters and thrown them all away. I've picked up the phone 100 times and couldn't dial. I kept telling myself I'd find the right words, but there aren't any right words for what I need to say. Dad, please let me finish. If I stop, I might not be able to start again." He looked up then, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "I was a coward, Grace. When your mother decided to give everything to Olivia and nothing to you, I knew it was wrong. I argued with her after you girls went to bed. I told her it wasn't fair, that you deserved support too, that we had enough for both of you." My throat tightened. I'd never known he'd tried. But she was convinced Olivia needed it more, that Olivia's opportunity was more important, that you were strong enough to make it on your own. And I was afraid. Afraid of the fight it would cause, afraid of what it would do to our marriage, afraid of having to choose between my wife and my daughter. His voice broke. "So I chose peace. I chose the easy path. I chose to let you walk out that door alone because it was easier than standing up to your mother." "You gave me Professor Wright's name," I said quietly. That was the least I could do, the absolute bare minimum. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "But I've been trying to do more. Trying to find a way to give back what you lost." He placed the box on my desk and pushed it toward me. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, nestled in white satin, was my grandmother's locket. I couldn't breathe. "How did you..." I've been searching for it for almost 3 years, Dad said. I went to every pawn shop within 100 miles. I called jewelry stores, checked online, marketplaces, hired someone to help me track it. I found it 6 months ago in a shop 2 states away. The owner had bought it from someone else, but I tracked the chain back to the original shop where you sold it. I lifted the locket out of the box with trembling fingers. It was exactly as I remembered the gold, worn smooth from my grandmother's years of wearing it, the tiny clasp still a little finicky. I opened it, and there was the picture Grandma and me smiling. It cost me $4,000 to get it back, Dad said. Best money I ever spent. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I couldn't make them stop. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. He pulled another item from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, and laid it on the desk beside the locket. This is a copy of the check your mother gave Olivia. I made it that night, and I've kept it in my desk drawer ever since. Every time I saw it, I was reminded of my failure. Every time I looked at it, I knew I'd failed you. I unfolded the paper. $20,000 made out to Olivia Miller, dated 3 years ago. The physical evidence of the moment that had changed everything. I kept it as proof. Dad continued, his voice thick with emotion. Proof that I was a coward. Proof that I chose wrong. Proof that I need to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. I stood up and walked around the desk. Dad rose to meet me, and we stood face to face, this man who had loved me silently and failed me loudly, and I saw him clearly for the first time. Not as a father who should have been perfect, but as a human being who had been weak when I needed him to be strong. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. He held me tight, and we both broke down crying in a way we'd never allowed ourselves before. I cried on his shoulder, and he cried into my hair, and all the words we'd never said to each other poured out in tears instead. You didn't fail me, Dad, I whispered against his chest. You were just human. But you deserved a father who was braver, he said, his voice muffled. I pulled back to look at him, wiping my eyes. I have one now. We stood there for a long time, holding each other. The locket still clutched in my hand. The copy of the check lying on my desk like a ghost, finally being laid to rest. Forgiveness came easier than I thought. But some wounds take longer to heal, especially the ones that hurt the most. Dad's call came on a Tuesday evening in December, 6 months after our reconciliation. I was grading papers in my apartment wrapped in a blanket against the winter cold when my phone rang. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. Grace, it's your mother. She's in the hospital. It's serious. My first instinct was to say I wouldn't come. We hadn't spoken since the ceremony. She hadn't reached out, hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged what had happened. Part of me felt like I owed her nothing, but Dad's voice was breaking, and I heard something in it that made me hesitate. Not just fear, regret. Please, he said. She's asking for you. I drove home the next morning, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my stomach in knots. I hadn't been back to my childhood house in 3 years. Seeing it from the street with its familiar blue shutters and the oak tree in the front yard made me feel like a ghost visiting my own past. The hospital was 20 minutes away. Dad met me in the lobby, looking exhausted. He hugged me briefly, then led me through sterile white corridors to a room on the 3rd floor. She's very weak, he warned me before opening the door. She looks different. Different was an understatement. The woman lying in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the perfectly coiffed, imperious mother I remembered. She was thin, almost skeletal, her skin pale and papery. Her hair, once dyed and styled meticulously, was grey and limp against the pillow. An IV fed into her arm, and monitors beeped softly beside her. When she saw me, tears immediately filled her eyes and spilled down her hollow cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I stood frozen in the doorway, not knowing what to feel. Anger, yes. Hurt. But also something unexpected. Pity. Dad gently guided me to the chair beside the bed and then stepped back, giving us space. Mum reached for something on the bedside table with a trembling hand. an envelope old and yellowed. She held it out to me, her fingers shaking so badly, I had to take it before she dropped it. Inside was a medical document dated 6 years ago. Stage 3 ovarian cancer. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. 6 years ago. That was before the family dinner, before the check, before everything fell apart. Beneath the diagnosis was a letter in my mother's handwriting, though shakier than I remembered. I had to read it twice before I could process what it said. I knew I was dying when you both were still so young. I thought if I pushed Olivia harder, gave her everything, she'd survive without me. I thought you were strong enough to make it on your own. I was wrong. You were always the strong one, but you needed to hear it from me. I'm sorry I waited until now. I'm sorry I let fear make me cruel. I looked up at her, this woman who had wounded me so deeply, and saw her with different eyes. She hadn't been cruel because she hated me. She'd been cruel because she was dying and terrified. I pulled the chair closer to the bed and took her hand. It felt like bird bones wrapped in tissue paper. You were scared, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, tears flowing faster now. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I was so afraid that if I loved you, both equally, I wouldn't have time to prepare her. I thought she needed me more. I thought you'd be okay without me. She coughed, wincing with pain. But I hurt you instead. I hurt you so much. I squeezed her hand gently. You were wrong about Olivia needing you more, but you were also wrong about me being okay without you. I needed you too. I know, she whispered. I know that now. I see what you've become, and I realise I almost destroyed the strongest person in this family. She looked at me with exhausted, pleading eyes. Do you forgive me? The question hung between us. Could I forgive her? Should I? I thought about the girl who'd sold her grandmother's locket. I thought about collapsing in that coffee shop. I thought about all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep believing I wasn't good enough. And I thought about the woman I'd become in spite of it all, maybe even because of it all. I'm trying, I said finally. I can't promise you I'm there yet, but I'm trying, and that's all I can give you right now. Mum smiled just slightly, and it transformed her wasted face into something almost peaceful. That's more than I deserve, she said. You've always been stronger than all of us. We sat together as afternoon faded into evening. Dad brought us coffee and sandwiches that neither of us touched. Olivia came after work and she sat on the other side of the bed, and for a few hours we were almost a family again. Broken and scarred, but together. That night I stayed at the hospital, sleeping in the chair beside Mum's bed, holding her hand. She drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever she woke, she squeezed my fingers. Just before dawn, I felt her grip loosen. Her breathing, which had been laboured and painful, suddenly became quiet. Then it stopped. I held her hand for a long time after watching the sun rise through the hospital window, and I whispered the words I couldn't say when she'd asked. I forgive you. She left this world before I could say I forgive you. But maybe she heard it in the way I held her hand. 5 years after my mother died, Olivia called me with the news that made me cry for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I had a baby, she said, her voice trembling with joy and exhaustion. A little girl. I named her Emma. I drove to the hospital that afternoon and held my niece for the first time. She was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. Olivia watched us from her bed, tears streaming down her face. When I look at her, Olivia said quietly, I think about you, about who I want her to become. I want her to know what real worth means. Not what someone gives you, but what you build yourself. Olivia raised Emma alone. She'd gotten divorced 2 years earlier, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, refused help from Dad even when things got tight. She wanted to give her daughter what we'd never had, the example of a mother who earned her keep, who taught strength through living it. I watched from a distance, proud of the woman my sister had become. And I watched Emma grow this bright-eyed girl who asked a million questions and wasn't afraid of hard work. 18 years later, Emma applied to college. I was in my office at the university when Olivia called her voice thick with emotion. "She got in," Olivia said. "Full acceptance. But Grace, we can't afford it. I've saved what I could, but it's not nearly enough. I don't know what to do." "Wait for the financial aid letters," I said calmly. "Sometimes there are surprises." The letter arrived 3 days later. Olivia called me sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "She got it," she managed between gasps. "The Grace Miller Scholarship. Full ride. 4 years. Everything." "That's wonderful," I said, though, of course, I already knew. I'd been on the selection committee, I'd watched Emma's application come through, had read her essay about growing up watching her mother work 3 jobs, about learning that strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting back up. I'd recused myself from the vote, but I'd known what the decision would be. Emma was exactly the kind of student we'd created the scholarship for. I visited them that weekend. Emma answered the door, this young woman who looked so much like Olivia, but carried herself differently, with a quiet confidence that reminded me of someone else. It took me a moment to realise she reminded me of myself. "Aunt Grace," she said, throwing her arms around me. Thank you so much." "You earned it," I told her, "every bit of it." Inside, I handed Olivia a small velvet box. She knew immediately what it was. Her hand shook as she opened it. The golden locket lay inside, catching the afternoon light. "I can't take this," Olivia whispered. "It's not for you," I said gently. "It's for Emma." I turned to my niece, who was watching with confused curiosity. I took the locket from the box and held it up. "Your great-grandmother gave this to me when I needed to believe in myself," I said. "She told me I was stronger than I knew. I sold it once when I had nothing else. Your grandfather found it and gave it back to me, and your mother taught me what forgiveness really means." I clasped it around Emma's neck. "Now it's yours, to remind you that you're worthy no matter what anyone says. To remind you that your value isn't something anyone can give you or take away." Emma touched the locket with trembling fingers, tears spilling down her cheeks. Olivia pulled both of us into a hug, the 3 of us crying together in her small living room. "Thank you for breaking the cycle," Olivia whispered in my ear. "Thank you for giving her what we never had." That evening, I returned to my office on campus. It was quiet, most of the students gone for the weekend. I sat at my desk and looked at the wall across from me where a large frame held 3 items. On the left, the photocopy of that check from so many years ago, the one Dad had kept as proof of his failure. I'd had it mounted behind glass, the words "Pay to the order of Olivia Miller, $20,000, still visible but crossed out with a single red line and new words written above, "Pay to the order of every girl who was told she didn't deserve it." In the centre, my PhD diploma earned through years of work and stubbornness and refusing to quit. On the right, a photo from that last Christmas before Mum got too sick to leave the hospital. 4 of us standing together, awkward but trying. Mum, Dad, Olivia and me. The last photo of us all together smiling like maybe we'd figured something out. Below the frame, a small plaque read, "She deserved it." But so did I. And so does every girl who comes after us. The next morning, I stood before a lecture hall full of freshmen. It was the first day of introduction to educational policy, and I could see the mix of excitement and terror on their faces. Some of them, I knew from their files, were first-generation students. Some were working multiple jobs, some had families who believed in them, and some were doing this alone. A young woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. "Dr. Miller, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "I read about your story online, about how you built all this." She gestured vaguely, meaning the scholarship program, the office, everything. "How did you keep going when everyone told you to quit?" I smiled, remembering a version of myself who would have been too afraid to ask that question, too afraid to take up space. "I didn't keep going because I was strong," I said. "I kept going because quitting felt like letting them win." And somewhere along the way, I realized something important. The only person who gets to decide if you're enough is you, not your parents, not your teachers, not society, you. And once you understand that, really understand it, no one can take it away from you. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly they were all applauding these fresh-faced students who were just beginning their own journeys, and I saw myself in every single one of them. After class, I walked across campus as the sun set, painting the old buildings gold. I touched the locket at my throat, thinking about Grandma, about Mum, about Emma wearing this same locket as she started her own story. Maybe Mum was right that day. Maybe Olivia did deserve that check, that support, that chance. But so did I. And now, so does every girl who refuses to let someone else write her ending. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right. Thank you so much for staying with me through Grace's entire journey. Her story reminds us that sometimes the people who doubt us the most end up witnessing our greatest triumphs, not because we sought revenge, but because we refuse to let their limitations define our potential. Grace's mother thought she was making a practical decision that night at the dinner table. She believed she was investing in the daughter who deserved it most. But what she didn't understand was that worth isn't something we're born with or something others can measure. It's something we build piece by piece through every choice we make when things get hard. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt like you had to prove yourself to people who didn't believe in you? Have you experienced favoritism in your own family or watched someone else struggle with it? Maybe you've been on the other side like Olivia, realizing too late that privilege without purpose leaves you empty. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if Grace's journey moved you, if her resilience inspired you, or if you simply want to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every subscription tells me that these stories matter, that your time here was worth it, and that we're building something meaningful together. Remember, the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right. You're stronger than anyone ever told you. You're worth more than anyone ever made you feel. And your story isn't over yet. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.